It's all-out war this week with Goku and co coming up against an entire army, and with it comes a pretty chunky array of talented animators. This is an episode that moves extremely well with polished art throughout, but it's an episode of surprisingly inconsistent direction and storyboarding, partly thanks to a certain elephant in the room that I have yet to address in any of my videos so far. But before we get there, let's introduce the top-line staff. Helming the board and direction duties this week is Takao Kiriyama. As a bit of a refresher, they're a fairly fresh talent who rose through the ranks on Dragon Quest Dai and Super Dragon Ball Heroes. And while they directed episode 3 of Daima, they didn't handle both the board and direction until episode 9, and the results there were a little bit of a mixed bag. The action was mostly well done, and there were some extremely cool ideas when it came to lighting, but overall, a lot of the framing felt a bit uninspired and flat, and at times, even claustrophobic. And that is almost one-to-one with how I feel about this episode too. The action across this episode is fantastic stuff, don't get me wrong, not just with the solo encounters but with the team-ups too. In an episode with so many moving parts, trying to stitch together scenes organically is always going to be a monumental struggle, but I think Kiriyama handled things quite elegantly by boarding action in singular cuts that flow from person to person pretty nicely. Even in scenes that aren't a singular cut, the way other characters step in to transition to their sequence works well, and I think the overall back half of this episode's action felt really nice and cohesive as a result. I think where it definitely struggles though is in its scale. Sadly, an issue that has become a bit of a recurring problem in this show. This is meant to be a big battle, one against an entire army within the huge wasteland surrounding the castle, but when it comes down to it, the majority of the framing is just so small. It's the same and perhaps most prevalent within the town too, where a single long shot showcases immense scale, but then the framing across everything else is just like a teeny tiny Lego set. Everything is pulled so tightly in, the backgrounds feel so shallow that the scope of what's actually happening here is just never really conveyed. But if there's one part where Kiriyama really did shine, it's in the flashback. The use of shadow here and the cool transitions are great. I am a big fan of the color work, and the scale is somehow really well done in this. There's so much great framing and interesting lighting, and he's not afraid to whip out the wide angles to avoid that claustrophobic feeling. It's a shining light for the direction in this episode that tells me he probably has a promising career ahead of him. I just wish this could have been applied to the battles. The elephant in the room in this episode, however, is the structure of its script. I talk about visuals on this channel, so scripting is very rarely a relevant talking point, but I think the lack of tension and peculiar flow found in this episode is very much a result of that script, and not something even the best director could have fixed. For those who don't know, every single episode of this series has been written by one person, Yuko Kakihara. She's perhaps most well known for writing the Digimon Tri movies and the Urusei Yatsura reboot, which certainly aren't glowing endorsements, but to each their own. The reason I bring her up is that this episode mandates a lot of peculiar breakaways. As much as I love the visuals of the flashback, jumping into a narrated vignette detailing the origins of the Demon Eye is always going to fundamentally break the build-up of tension. Not to mention the entire approach just feels completely antithetical to how Dragon Ball is typically structured. Moreover, Kiriyama is forced to contend with scenarios like the King Kadam Squad death fake-out that is almost laughable in its conception, or there's the extended conversation sequence taking place right in the midst of a tiny gunfight that just isn't ever going to work out no matter how you spin it. When the concept of what you need to execute just isn't great on paper, that unfortunately severely limits what you can do, and to me, that was this episode's #1 issue over anything else. Thankfully, there is still a hell of a lot to love outside of my small complaints, and I don't want to give off the impression that I didn't like what this episode offered, especially on the visuals front. This is the return of Kozue Komatsu, the animation supervisor behind the Goku vs Tamagami fight, and man does she nail it once again this week. She really is such an incredible artist, and all throughout this episode there are so many wonderful looking drawings that not only confirmed my suspicions about her style, but pushed her right up the list as one of my favorite supervisors on this show. Something about her work feels like a mix of Shintani, Suji, and even Nakatsuru, and it all comes together to form something that feels really three-dimensional and even old school unbelievable at times. Under her work comes one hell of an array of animators, with what looks like French-Korean animator Jukebox tackling the opening section here. He's someone who has done some fantastic work on One Piece since hopping on board there, but has maybe had the most eyes on him, unaware or otherwise, thanks to his effects work on some League of Legends cinematics. His last appearance on Daima was back on episode 10 under Naohiro Shintani, where he animated the Kraken rising out of the water, and if this is truly his work on this episode, then this is a substantial step up. The movement has a real bouncy quality to it that feels evocative of the type of work that Yohei Sasaki has been doing, but aside from that great movement with all of its fun smears, it's those excellent effects from the impact frames to the great lightning bolts that I really like the most. Shoutouts to Komatsu especially, who added the cool highlights and the lighting through her corrections too. That is a great touch. Following this looks like what may be Mikio Fujihara's work, another one of those animators who's extremely famous for their badass effects work. He's predominantly associated with Precure and Kitaro, and that's exactly where you'll find some spectacular work from him over the years. While this is pretty conservative in comparison to some of those scenes, it's still great, and it's impossible not to notice the idiosyncratic way it erupts and dissipates. There's a surprising number of great effects animators on board this week. Kazunori Ozawa is maybe the biggest example of this, in that it's almost a meme at this point that if he shows up on a show, he's probably going to animate a massive fuck-off explosion and then peace out, and that's exactly what he does here. The movement is a little bit janky, but I think that's to be expected given he's not only on basically every anime under the sun, so he's exceptionally busy, but he's also kind of famously not great with animating people compared to effects, which, hey, is probably why they hired him to do 2D effects for Superhero 2. For me though, the most surprising sequence in this first segment is from Nightberry. He's a young French animator who was last on the series a couple episodes ago animating a Kraken, but this is a totally different level. Not only is the movement extremely fluid and gestural with great flow, but even his effects are top drawer here. Check out the detail on the debris during the explosion. That stuff is crazy for what is effectively half a second of screen time. They really kick this episode off with a bang, and while the next 10 minutes are occupied with predominantly dialogue, even that is granted some fantastic animation in spots. Check out the insane detailing on the water in this Kraken flashback. It genuinely makes me cry thinking about drawing all that detail in, and again, all of this is for a total blink and you'll miss it scene. Once we do return back to the action though, we're granted a scene that illustrates an aspect of Kiriyama's direction that I really enjoyed. While I don't know who animated this particular sequence, it leads into this ramped, slow-mo moment of the gang in action that really reminded me of those great Hollywood battle sequences. Sander, an animator I probably don't need to introduce at this point, tackles a nice sequence of the Kadan squad battling, and that too contains another instance of this slowdown effect. I think as long as it's not so abused as to feel disruptive, it's a great way to sell impact and allow the audience to take in the framing of a scene, and of course, I already mentioned just how well all of this flows together as a single cut. Winding back a bit, Kenosuke, who's typically been delivering crazy action scenes on this show, drops in with a very short and effects-driven sequence of the tanks showing up, which I imagine is probably because he was already balls deep prepping sequences for the upcoming battles instead. It's actually another familiar face, Tadayoshi Yamamuro, who I want to talk about though. There's a sequence here that's pretty damn good and looks a fair bit like his work. These effect shapes are basically identical to how he draws them, and there are shot compositions that are also extremely evocative of his hero's work. But then there's something about the timing that's kind of different to his work, and the art has been almost entirely redrawn by Komatsu to the point that I can't really see many traces of Yamamuro's raw style. I find that a little strange because he's credited as assistant animation director, and you can see his artwork in other sequences untouched with its oh so familiar super look to it. So it makes me wonder if this scene is Yamamuro's own work redrawn by Komatsu, someone else's work corrected by Yamamuro and then Komatsu, or if it's just not Yamamuro at all. I'm not really sure of the answer, but I really like this, so fingers crossed we get an official answer to this in the future. The star of this episode, however, is the one and only Shuuichiro Manabe, an animator we have not seen a substantial contribution from since episode 10, and man was he cooking in that time. This is one of the best action sequences in Daima so far. This is such a speedy, fucking relentless ruthless assault to the senses, this has everything. Visceral impact frames, incredible poses and dynamic movement, snappy timing, and a genuine sense of scale. Manabe has delivered fantastic work across this series time and time again, but this truly sits above them all and had my jaw on the floor. This really brought back so many fond memories of his fantastic scenes across Super, and I'm so looking forward to seeing what he can deliver across all of these upcoming final episodes. I'm not gonna lie though, I felt a little bit mixed on Daima as of late, but with the narrative ramping up once again, I'm curious more than ever to see how they can deliver on this finale. The next episode's already looking great, at least, with the military force jumping into action, and I'm really loving the use of shadow in a lot of these preview shots. I feel like I'm seeing a mix of Shintani and Yamamuro, so that'll be a fun mix to break down if that's truly the case. In the meantime though, let me know in the comments section, how are you feeling about Daima so far? I've definitely felt like interest has kind of dipped a little bit, especially from a community standpoint, so I'll be interested to hear how you feel and whether you have any hopes for what a climax to the show could look like. But otherwise, that is it for now. Be sure to drop me a like if you enjoyed this, subscribe if you're new, and I will see you next time.